We asked for your questions on bone broth, and man, did you send them in. Today's episode is dedicated to answering all the questions we received about the wonder that is bone broth. We will cover sourcing your bones, what types of bones to use, cooking broth, including equipment, timings, add-ins, how you can make your broth thicker, thinner, stronger, weaker, the myriad of ways you can drink and eat your broth, nutrition and storage. There are so many ideas packed into the next 75 minutes. So whether you're a beginner at broth or have been making it for years, I'm sure you'll find help and encouragement in this episode. Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast with Alison, a European town dweller in central Italy, and Andrea, living on a newly created family farm in northwest Washington State, USA. Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancient ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen.
Good morning, Alison.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's nice to talk to you again.
Always nice to talk to you. This is an awesome episode based on an episode
Yeah, exactly.
that we
That's
already
weird,
did.
isn't it?
Yeah. So we got to talk to, well, actually, it was me. I think just I did.
Yeah.
I got to talk to Jill Shepard Davenport, and she and Dr. Kara N. Fitzgerald, they are the co-authors of Better Broths and Healing Tonics, 75 bone broth and vegetarian broth-based recipes for everyone. And I have it sitting in front of me, which is why I got the title so perfect. And this book's beautiful. Alison, when you told me, I have a book about broths I want you to read, I was like, really? Broth book? Haven't we read everything about broth? But I was wrong.
No.
Yeah, I
No.
was totally
It's a whole
wrong.
nother world, that book.
Yeah, I started reading the book after you had a copy sent to me, and instantly I was like, wait a minute, what have I been missing? And so this book is beautiful. And we, after that episode, asked everybody to send us their broth questions, which you did.
Yeah.
Y'all had some burning questions. Some of you, like one question that came up multiple times. Allison, we're just going to pretend that this podcast is really like, number one podcast in the world. We had hundreds of listeners asking us.
We did have a lot.
Hundreds.
We did have a lot.
We had a lot. Asking about pressure canning and asking about skimming broth. That came up multiple times.
Yep.
What bones to use. That came up many
Yep.
times. So we're going to answer all of that today. But before we do,
Yeah. This might be a long one, I think.
yeah. Before we do, I want to ask Alison if you ate your lunch today before we started.
Yes, I did. I'm nicely full, but I actually want to break with precedent and tell you what I had for breakfast. I never get to talk to you about breakfast because we always record afternoon my time. But I thought, considering this is a broth episode and my breakfast had a lot of broth in it, I could tell you about my breakfast for a change, and people can actually hear the sort of thing I ate for breakfast. So I got up early and had a cup of broth. There we go. First time we say broth in this episode. Going to be hundreds of them.
An auspicious start.
With a small spoonful of miso stirred in. So I heat up the broth and then take a little bit of the broth and kind of break up the miso spoonful with it and then stir it in. And it makes it a bit sort of salty and gives it a different flavour. So I had that, and then I got on with some things in the kitchen whilst Gabriel was getting ready for school. Mixed up a lectin-free bread and did some water kefir. And then once the house was peaceful and everyone had gone, I usually wait till then for my breakfast. I put a little bit more broth into a small saucepan, and then I put 2 or 3 spoonfuls of some meat juice that was left from me cooking some pork in lard last week. which is like a confit, and the juice that separated from the lard that was left over at the bottom was so like jelly and so tasty. I put a couple of spoonfuls of that in. And then I put some leftover sorghum in, which we'd cooked, I think, yesterday, and heated that up a little bit so everything kind of melted nicely. And then I put an egg in it and put the lid on and left it for like 4 or 5 minutes. And I had some fresh parsley in the fridge and scissored that into it, and it was absolutely delicious. Really lovely. And I thought, broth and broth, that's really apt for our broth
Yeah.
episode, really. And it's
Yeah.
easy
I like it.
because, the broths, like so many things we talk about on the podcast, everything's done before. The broth is done before, the meat juice thing is done before, parsley was in the fridge, and the sorghum was just, we cook a lot of that and leave it in the fridge, and then it's available. So it was really yummy. How about you? Have you had breakfast?
Not really.
No. Okay.
I brought down a slice of sandwich bread, like a homemade sandwich bread, and some cheese and butter, but that's just to keep me going until, second breakfast. But the dinner we had last night, I guess, was not based on broth at all. But we had chicken wings. So
Okay.
when we did the last 40 chickens, we cut them into pieces instead of putting them in the freezer whole. Part of the motivation was it's easier to make them fit when they're in smaller pieces.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so we made some packs of just wings. And so we cooked those, or I cooked those, I guess I should say, and we had a salad and some potatoes. So pretty simple, simple sort of a situation.
Do you put the wings in the oven?
Delicious. No, I did them on the stovetop.
And do you put anything on them before you fry them?
Well, first I poured some lard in the pan because what do you use lard for, right? Everything.
Yeah.
I put lard in the pan and then I put them in. And then for Christmas, I got Jacob this bottle of sauce. And so we had used half of it already, and I used the other half to put on this round.
Yeah.
And it was pretty tasty. And then everybody started dipping their potatoes in the sauce too. So they liked the sauce.
Sounds delicious. Really,
Yeah,
really
it
nice.
was. It was quite tasty.
Even if there was no broth involved. Although the bones are left over, obviously, from the wings. So those bones probably will go into the broth pot, I guess.
Well, you would think. But actually, our dogs looked so pitiful and interested in what we were eating that I gave them the bones last night. Because I also just strained off a couple of gallons of broth the day before. And I just wasn't feeling the urgent need to have more broth going. So
yeah, I get that. I've got my stock pot is upstairs. It's not a very big one, but it's full of beef bones, because the whole morning breakfast stock thing, since Christmas I've been doing it every day, every morning, having a cup of broth first thing before my breakfast and letting the liquid go down before I eat. And so my broth kind of output in the kitchen has had to be more consistent, so I can't kind of run out. I need to always have a cup. So I've got some up there on the go.
I should have heated some broth.
It's kind of continuum
to drink while we're recording. Why didn't I do that?
Yeah.
Weird.
I don't know. Next time. Okay, well, before we dive into broth, we've got a couple of reviews to read you. And thank you ever so much to everyone who has reviewed us. I said on an episode just, I think, before the end of last year that we were looking for 2 more reviews to get to 100 reviews, and we've got more than 2 more reviews. So thank you to everyone who's leaving us a review. And I'd like to read one from Lizzie, which is a 5-star review. Thank you, Lizzie. Lizzie is a Patreon and is on our Discord channel and has been involved in our private podcasts. Really wonderful to have you on board, Lizzie. And she said in her review, informative, comforting and inspiring. I have binge listened to this podcast since I found it on my health journey. I've learned so much by listening, all the while being inspired and comforted. The interview style is very effective in getting information for the listeners, but has a laid-back quality that is just calming. I have found myself numerous times while listening getting excited about the subjects discussed. I feel like I have known Andrea and Alison for years, even though we've never met. what a treasure this place is, and it has helped me in more ways than I can say here. If you want to be inspired, get tips on healthier eating, or just want to learn, this is the place. Thank you, Lizzie.
Well, thank you, Lizzie. I like that
Yeah.
she said comforting. I feel
Yeah.
comforted when I talk to you, so I get it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice. It's a really lovely thing for us to talk
Mhm,
together. And lots of people say that to me, that the podcast is calming and comforting.
mhm.
So that feels good to me because I think we all need that in
Yeah.
this world we live in. So that
Well,
pleases me.
do you remember the review where somebody said, please tell us who you are because we like that review.
Mm.
Somebody said that they listened to it instead of crime podcasts.
Yeah. Oh,
And it
it's a
made
big
me think
change.
how many things in our life are like these high nervous system stimulating sort of
Mm.
things, and how nice it is when you run into something that helps you bring your nervous system back into regulation.
Yeah.
And it's good if the podcast is one of those. I have a review to read
Okay.
from Laura Ruster. And she titled it A Blessing. And she said, Andrea and Allison have become my new companions while cooking, cleaning, and walking. I am blessed by their knowledge and feel inspired and determined after every episode. They help to make a healthy, traditional lifestyle accessible to us everyday, regular folk who are just trying to live the best we can. I am ever so grateful. Yes, we are those folk, everyday folk.
Exactly. Exactly. I think there's a lot of food podcasts out there that are
I was just thinking that.
what's the word? Not sensationalist,
32-year-old single
but
male
yeah,
with no kids and
just either really ramped up or really just so much information that's quite glossy.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think we try to be real. We are real. We're two mums who sit in
Yeah.
their various kind of basement stroke bedrooms and record when we find the time. We're not a media outlet. We're just us two gals here with you listening.
We just we just want to bring you into our kitchen with us,
Yeah.
which is, and then it sounds like she brought us into her kitchen with her
Yeah.
listening while cooking and cleaning.
Yeah.
So we're all hanging out in the kitchen together, real folks cooking real meals, not molecular scientists with nothing to do but, hire massage therapists or something like that. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
all right. Well, then, on that note, let us
Mm-hmm.
give the people what they want and talk about
Mm.
food. And let's go to Broth, our Q&A
Yeah.
collection.
Thank you to
Questions
everyone who
between,
left questions.
uh-huh. Yes, thank you.
If you're into ancestral eating, you'll know that liver is a superfood. Full of vitamin A, K, and a whole host of B vitamins, plus many essential minerals. It has a truly exceptional nutrient profile and is a staple of traditional healthy diets. But it's not always as easy to get liver into our lives as we want. Getting a good supply, knowing how to cook it so it actually tastes good, and getting all of our family to eat it. These things can be hard, especially when we're busy or travelling. That's where Andrea and I turn to liver capsules. They give us the incredible benefits of liver without having to worry about the sourcing, the preparation, or the eating. One Earth Health produces organ capsules from 100% grass-fed New Zealand-raised cattle. As a podcast listener, you can get 5% off and free shipping by using the link oneearthhealth.com/ancestral kitchen. And each time you order, you'll also be supporting us to keep on making the podcast. Details and the link are in the show notes. So
Those are good
what we've
questions.
done, because there were so many questions and there were so many different topics, we tried to sort them into subject areas.
Mhm.
And where two people ask the same question or three people ask the same question, we kind of bunch them together. Can I start, Andrea, just by clarifying the difference between meat stock and bone broth?
I wish you would.
I think there's just some confusion around this if you're not into making stocks or haven't quite yet got to it. And there are two kind of different liquids you can make. The first one is meat stock, which is made from sometimes, a fair few bones, but bones that have meat on them. So, for example, you might do a whole chicken to make a meat stock, or you might have some parts of a cow that have some bone in and meat left on them. And that is different from bone broth because bone broth is predominantly bones. Now, there may be a bit of meat left on the bones and cartilage and whatever else, but bone broth is predominantly bones and meat stock is predominantly meat, although both might have a bit of the other in. Meat stock is cooked for less time. And when I make meat stock, I eat the meat that comes out of my slow cooker. I would make all my stocks in a slow cooker. And I don't want that meat to be kind of overcooked and dry. So, for example, if I put a whole chicken into my slow cooker, I'm going to cook it for probably 4 hours. That depends on how hot your slow cooker is. And then I'm going to eat the meat or make a soup with the meat. And then I've got my stock, which was surrounding that chicken. If I make a bone broth, I'm going to leave it for much longer, usually 24 hours or kind of whenever I get back to thinking about it after I've put it on. And I generally don't eat the stuff that comes out, although Rob does pick at all the bits and bobs on the bones because he likes them. The difference in nutrition and digestion is that it's easier to digest meat stock. It's because it's not cooked for so long, it doesn't have so much histamine in it and it doesn't have so much glutamine in it. And because of that, it's easier on your tummy. Bone broth has more protein in it, more amino acids because the bones are in there for longer and all that stuff is being pulled out, but it's harder to digest. So for diets like, for example, GAPS or AIP, often when you're beginning those, people would suggest meat stock rather than bone broth and see how you get on with that before you transition to bone broth because it's easier for you to digest. Have I missed anything, Andrea, on those two subjects?
No, but you did make me think Rob would make such a good caveman.
Oh, he would. Oh, seriously, he would. He he eats all the bits that. I'm like, really? That's just
Okay.
blobbles. That's blobbles of something. And then he just takes all the bones and nobbles the ends off the bones. And
Mhm.
he's good because I don't throw away as much because of Rob,
Yeah,
which is
that
nice.
is good. That is good.
Okay, do you want to dive into our questions now in the first kind of section of them and
Let's go.
see where we go
Let's
from
do
there?
it.
Go on then. Go on then. You start.
All right. All right, we'll start with sourcing. Andrea Thomas 78 asked, "My biggest hurdle is finding quality bones." Anna E. Brooks asked, or she said, "Finding local and quality sourced bones is difficult."
Mhm.
So we had some questions around finding bones. How do you answer this, Allison?
Yeah, I mean, these days you can buy bones on the internet. So I mean, my
Really?
initial response, yeah, my initial response is just to talk to people. Sometimes it's hard though if you've just moved to a new area or you're living in a place in a city and you're not sure where the farms are. Generally, just talk to as many people as you possibly can. Talk to friends, talk to people who work in shops, talk to butchers, talk to people at farmers markets, talk to anyone who shows a slight interest in
Hmm.
bones and ask them and give them your details and say if they hear anyone, can they pass it to you. All the Flavio, my farmer here, I didn't find on the internet. I found because someone mentioned something to me and I was like, hang on, okay,
Uh-huh.
who's he? And I had to kind of prod that person a few more times for the person to send me the information. But in the end, I did. So I would say start by talking to people. But if you're in a position where you haven't been able to do that yet, or that's going to take some time to happen, then do check the internet for local farms. You can check
Hmm.
Facebook groups, homesteading groups, Facebook Western price groups, that kind of thing, and ask them. And until those things come through, you can go, like as I said earlier, and get bones online from national suppliers. who will send you meat or often just carcasses, chicken carcasses or bones, and you can use those. Have
Uh-huh.
you got things
Yeah.
to add, Andrea?
Yeah, I would only emphasize what you said, that talking to people is the way to find it. Anna has actually come out to the farm. She and her sister and their husbands and their babies came out and helped us out, and just did a farm project for us, which was super awesome. So thank you for that.
Hmm.
And I would concur with talk to your butcher. Ask them. Sometimes they sell frozen blocks of bones. Usually they expect you're going to feed it to a dog. But you can ask them to cut
Mm.
it into blocks, because a giant frozen block of bones, FYI, you need a saw to get through, and
Yeah,
quite
we've
a lot
been
of
there.
muscle
Oh
power.
gosh.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah.
Um, so that works. Also, Azure Standard um, sells the organic chicken bones in frozen cases, but again, it does come in a giant case. So either be prepared to thaw it all at once and cook, tons and tons and tons of broth, or have your husband saw it into blocks, which is what I did.
Okay.
Also, ask people who hunt. I know you said, Allison, it's not as
Oh
common in the
yeah.
UK, but it's pretty
No.
common over here. If they hunt deer or something, ask them if they're going to use their bones. I have never once heard anybody say that they do. And ask if you can have the bones for broth. You'll probably need to pay cut and wrap. Um, or yeah, like you said, talk to a butcher. If you know a small butcher, not like a big chain butcher or something, but just a small one, ask them if they are using all the bones, or if you know somebody who sends pigs or cows in of their own to get butchered, ask if you can have the bones. And always offer, if I say if I didn't want the bones for my pig and I raised a pig and I sent her in to be butchered and you asked for the bones, I would appreciate if the person asking for the bones offered to pay or barter or in some way give an energetic exchange for that. Um, it's just a kindness. And then, or tell that person, hey, I'll make you broth out of these bones.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
would possibly say yes. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I would say.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, our next section is types of bones, and we've got a few questions on that. So,
Yeah, we got a lot
Kylie
on that.
Kylie Smith said, "I know grass-fed is best, but I have bones in my freezer from conventionally raised beef. Are these still okay to use? Found out I shouldn't be using the conventional fat to render the tallow." So my thoughts on this are that it's okay to use conventionally raised beef bones. In the book that Andrea was talking about at the beginning, Better Broths and Healing Tonics, they did tests for both organic and conventional bones. They tested them for heavy metals and found both of them to be under the allowed levels in the US. Ideally, we'd use organic because, we want to give our body the best and because we want to support the agriculture that those farmers are doing. But I'd say don't not have broth because you can't get organic bones. Um, do you agree, Andrea?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Use them
Okay.
up.
Cool. Okay, I'll read the next one and then you can talk about it. So this is from Farm on the MNT, which I presume is Farm on the Mount. And they ask, "We have 2 lambs to butcher this year. Is lamb broth a thing? Any tips?"
Mm.
Andrea, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Bones bones are for broth. If it has bones,
Yeah,
you can make broth out of it.
yeah, yeah,
Um, Also other things that you just hear about, the typical most popular ones are actually the ones that are typically grown in factories
yeah.
because they're the most common. And then being factory grown, then the non-factory versions are also equally popular. Pork, chicken, things like that. But,
Mm.
you know, guinea fowl, turkey, duck, those make great bones. Elk, deer, moose, those make great broths. And if you have a hunter in the family, as I said in the last one, almost
Mm.
100% of the time, people do not save those bones. So
Have
use
you ever
them.
had elk, deer, or moose stock?
No, none of us hunt.
I wonder if it
No, we're
tastes
not
and
hunters.
how different it tastes. That would be interesting.
Amanda up north
Yeah.
Callahan, our Alaskan
Yeah, you
reference.
interviewed her, didn't you?
Yeah,
Yeah, for the
she
podcast.
she uses so we do have elk down here, which are
Mm,
very lean, but she has moose, and being in a colder climate, they are fattier depending on when you get
yeah.
them. And so she has sent me pictures of her broths and her jars of golden fat from the moose, and it's quite remarkable.
Wow.
But yeah,
Sounds
she
delicious.
highly
I'll have to try
recommends.
it. So I just
Mhm,
wanted to add that I've made lamb broth before. Um, I've used lamb bones and I've also used a lamb head in the broth, and it was really
mhm,
delicious.
yeah,
Certainly, mutton broth, which is obviously an older sheep, was definitely a thing in England for a very long time. I've read quite a lot of Dorothy Hartley's Food in England book, and it's talked about mutton broth all the time. So, I think that's because lots of sheep were available for people, and therefore they used the bones of what they had around them, which is kind of
yeah.
what you were saying, Andrea.
Yeah, heads
Okay.
are a good resource. I'm glad you said that. Goat heads, sheep
Yeah.
heads, calf heads, cow heads,
Yeah.
lamb heads. Those are good for broth. And be like those.
Indeed. And pig heads as well, making head cheese
Mhm,
like
mhm, yeah.
people in the Discord group have been doing, and making lovely stock at the same time.
Chicken and turkey heads while we're at it. Those make good
Yeah.
broth too.
Do you want to read the next question?
Yep. My Dandelion Days says, I have a freezer full of bones from our half cow purchase. Doesn't matter what bones I use for broth. I'm a complete broth newbie, but there's no better time to try. I agree. And Rebecca Noreen also says, are there certain bones that are better to use than others? What do you say, Allison?
I say use any bones. If they're bones, use them. Um, if you're bothered about your broth being gelatinous, that is thick
Hmm.
and goes like jelly when you put it in the fridge, then use things that have the stuff in that are going to make it gelatinous. So chicken feet
Hmm.
or pig trotters. What say you?
I agree. I agree. Any bone off the animal. We just broke down a pig on the kitchen table the other day. Every single bone, spine, scapula, knuckles, everything got used for various broths.
Mm,
Ancestral tradition says if you're having trouble with some part of your body, then you eat the same part of an animal or even plants that look like that part. Ancestral tradition also, of course, assumes a healthy, high genetic expression animal. So if you have knee pain, you'd eat a knee. You'd make broth from the joint
yeah.
and get all that collagen and gelatin and goodness. So the feet, hooves, and ligamentous joints are great if you want those jiggly broths.
Yeah, exactly. Jiggly broths, jiggly broths. I think we've got another question about that later on as well. Okay, next
Oh,
question
good.
from iBar Pat, who's Eileen. I know Eileen. Hello. For
Mhm.
bone beef broth, that's quite a word, isn't it? Bone beef broth. Which bones are best to use, and how many would I need? So we go with what we said earlier: any bones, any bones. Regarding how many you need, it depends on the size of your pot, but what you need to do really is pack those bones tightly into your pot if you want a broth that's not going to be too watery. So, for example, my slow cooker is 6 litres, which is about 6 quarts, and I would use then 2 to 4 pounds in the US of bones packed in really tightly. That's about 2 kilograms of bones. So this morning, when I set my broth up upstairs, I roasted the bones beforehand. You don't have to, you can put them straight in without roasting them. But I roast them because I like what it does to the flavour of my broth. So I roasted all the bones that Flavio chopped up for me into medium pieces. And then I put them into my slow cooker, still warm, and I packed them in, and I put in an onion, and I put in a carrot, and I put in the end of a celery that I had, just a kind of dead end, the centre. And then I poured all the water in, and I just just covered the bones. It got to the top of the slow cooker, and I had to stop, otherwise there would have been an accident. So I would just say pack them in tightly into your space. What can you add to that, Andrea?
I would agree with you. Rule of thumb that I read, I want to say in maybe the Gap's book, um, drawing a
Oh,
blank on
yeah.
her name, Haley. I don't remember her
Hillary.
name. Hillary. Wow.
Or,
Awkward.
or
But
Natasha, which one?
Hillary's, yeah. She had said just cover the bones with water. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb
Yeah.
because no matter how big of a pot or small of a pot you use, it's pretty much equidistant for the from the
Yeah.
meats, you know. Um, I have always historically made my bones with way more water than the recipe calls for because I was always just trying to eke out more broth.
Hmm.
But right now, now that we butcher basically year round at this point, I've been doing the just cover with water rule, and you do indeed
Mm.
get a darker, more flavorful broth.
Yeah, I
But
just
there's
want to add something to
nothing wrong
that
with using more.
because I I used to use more water, but I've kind of
Mhm,
done it the
mhm.
other way now in that I make the broth with less water as long as those bones are just covered. And then I can taste the broth afterwards and I can see how strong it is. And then if I want to eke it out more and I'm not so bothered about the strength, I will add water when I'm warming it up or water, into what I'm
Right,
cooking it with. So I'm
right.
rather than putting more water in at the beginning, I'm choosing to put more water in afterwards.
Concur. And it's easier to store. There's not as much volume.
Yes.
But it kind of just depends, I suppose, on what your goal is, what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
go to the cooking section. So all about cooking broth.
Okay.
I'm going to start out
Okay.
with
Go on
River
then.
Valley Homestead. River Valley
Hmm.
Homestead says, I would like to know more about broth cook times. Is it different for different animals? What do you think, Allison?
I would say no. I don't vary my cook time for broths based on the bones that I'm putting in. Um, the Better Broth and Healing Tonics book, go back to that, says 20 hours for bone broths. I usually do, as I said, about 24 hours, no matter what the animal is. For meat stock, as I said at the beginning, that's shorter. So if I'm doing a whole chicken in the slow cooker, I'll probably just do it for 4 or 5 hours. Um, and that means that the meat doesn't go dry when I'm cooking it. But I wouldn't vary it based on the type of bones. Do you, Andrea?
No, I don't really vary it.
No.
I would say, yeah, if you need a low histamine or glutamine broth, then go with the GAPS recommendations, and that's the 4 hour meat stock you alluded to. If you want a clear broth, then lower heat, less time. Don't boil it. Don't let it come to a boil. Longtime listeners might remember Aaron saying that on an early episode.
Yeah.
And you would also want to wash the bones before cooking if you wanted a clear broth. And that's all about the aesthetic look. And I have never washed bones before using them. I doubt if you have, Allison.
Nope.
Nope. Yeah, that's more maybe so if you're looking for a specific look. But meat stock is easier to digest than bone broth, like you said. And then also logically, the thin bones can be cooked for shorter time. So I'm speaking
Yeah.
here of
Yeah.
fish. Yeah, fish bones you can cook as short as 45 minutes. Some fish can be cooked much longer, but I would Google the specific fish you're cooking because there are some fish, I believe it's like the flat fish, that release a glue tasting compound after long cooking time, but others can tolerate
Mm.
hours and hours. So I've only made fish stock one time. I cooked it for hours and hours and reduced it
Mm.
down to a very small amount of gelatinous broth. It was delicious, but I don't remember what the fish was. Something caught in the Lynn Haven Inlet up in Virginia. But I, like you, my broth usually follows a pattern of my day, less so that I think, here's how many hours I want to do. More so, I think,
Mm.
okay, am I leaving in the morning? What's happening? So if we eat, say, a roast bird for dinner, the stock goes on the stove overnight. I turn it off in the morning, and then it's cool by the time I'm back in the kitchen for lunch. And I would strain it at that time. And that's a
Yeah.
good pattern for me, but doesn't always happen that way.
Before we go on to the next question, there's two things that I want to pick up on what you said. I think this is going to be a long episode. The cooking broth and getting it clear. Now, I just watched Meredith Lee, who has already gone out on the podcast as an episode, and we're hoping to have another episode with her later in the year. I just watched one of her courses at the fermentation school. If you haven't got to know the fermentation school yet, check out our show notes because we've got a 10% discount on any of their courses for podcast listeners. And her course was on confit, roulette, and terrine, which is kind of what I was talking about when I cooked the meat in fat earlier on. And there's a bit in her course where she explains another way to get clear broth, which is to put protein in your broth once it's done and it's strained. Put a protein like egg white in it and cook it with that in. And then you can strain that protein out and it will make the broth clearer. I never knew that until I did that course. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was fish broth, because I realised I didn't even think about fish broth when we were preparing this episode. But before we moved to Italy the second time, we lived in Newlyn, which is very close to Penzance on the coast of Cornwall in the southwest of England. And it's a fishing port. And there were 3 fishmongers in the town. And I used to go there and get bones and make fish stock. And we were doing gaps at that time. And the fishmonger told me, don't use oily fish for fish stock, use white fish. And I made fish broth, I think, more than once. So I've done it more than you, but I'll tell you what, not much more. Because I really didn't have the recipes in my repertoire to use it in, you know? And it didn't feel so good to drink, just like the beef and the chicken is. And because we were on gaps, we were doing beef stews and, you know, that kind of thing. But I did do it, you know, several times, and I cooked it for a long period as well, just like you did, and it was fine. But yeah, definitely it was white fish, not oily fish. That's what I wanted to add it to that.
Good.
Okay.
Hey there, thank you for being a listener of the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast. It means so much to Allison and I when you post a review on Apple or Spotify, or share about the podcast in your stories, or send us a message and let us know what it means to you, which is hopefully something good. You can also sponsor the podcast through our Patreon account and help Rob buy weird gadgets to edit out my coughs and microphone bumps in the background. We have a variety of different levels you can choose from and a bunch of different benefits you can enjoy, ranging from additional interviews to video content and downloadable goodies. Check it out at patreon.com/Ancestral Kitchen Podcast.
Let's go to the next question. KS Fleming WI says, is it okay to make beef a bone broth by roasting the bones and then using an instant pot for the broth without skimming anything off the top in the process? And Arga Juice says, do electric pressure cookers work as well as crock pots or a pot on the stove for making broth? So we get to the skimming question, which has been fun. Now,
We
I don't have...
we hit the skimming question twice, a couple times. So this is a good one.
Yeah.
People want to know. Yeah.
So first of all, I don't have an Instapot, so I can't talk personally to that. But the book, Better Broths and Healing Tonics, which is available in our bookstore, we will link to that in the show notes, says to skim it first before turning it down to slow. Now, I don't skim. And preparing this episode made me think, am I doing something wrong? Am I doing something wrong? Because, you know, if Better Broths and Healing Tonics says skim, well, I think maybe I should be skimming. So I shared with you, Andrea, a thing about skimming, which I want to read, if that's all right.
I'd love for you to read it.
It's quite funny. So this is from a website, and I'm going to name check them, Miller's Bio Farm, Inspiring Healthy Generation. So it's a farm, and their website is millersbiofarm.com. And they have an article called, Do You Have to Skim the Scum When Making Yummy Healthy Broth? And I'm going to just move to the bit that's relevant. So, because this has taught me something. It's taught us both something, I think. Broth scum is simply denatured congealed protein. It comes from the meat, not the bones. It's not gelatin, which dissolves. It's mostly the same proteins that make up egg whites. It's harmless, it's flavourless, it's perfectly fine to eat, and probably shouldn't be given such a derogatory name. Maybe we should call it bone foam, or protein puddles, or broth clouds instead. So, why skim the scum? Some people think it looks gross and just need to get rid of it. Some people do it because of their tradition, it's what their mother or grandmother did. Some people do it because basically every recipe on the internet tells you to do it. And some people do it to achieve a refined culinary dish. If you leave the scum, it will break up into microscopic particles and disperse in your stock, making it cloudy. Straining later, even through layers of cheesecloth, won't remove it. Once it boils, the scum is there to stay. So that fits in with what you were saying about Aaron and what he said in his interview, which is don't boil it, because if you boil it, you get the scum. But it does let me off the hook in that I'm not doing anything wrong by not skimming my broth. I mean, I don't skim because I'm doing too many other things in the day, and I put the broth on and I leave it, and I can't keep going over and going, is it boiling it? Do I need to skim it? So I'm just going to call my scum broth clouds. I think that's my favourite of those three, and love it for what it is.
I like the bone foam one.
You like bone
I
foam?
like
Okay.
all those names. Yeah. And protein puddles makes me
Do you
laugh.
skim? Do you
No,
skim your scum?
no, I do not. I never do. No. And I always just kind of glossed over that part in the recipes when I was reading. I'm like, yeah.
Whatever.
Other people. And I always did kind of wonder, maybe I'm supposed to, but I don't know. Then I didn't. In Better Broths
Yeah.
on pages 34 and 35, she has charts showing cook times and steps for using your electric slow cooker and your pressure cooker. I have an
Okay, that's
instant
good.
pot.
Mm.
Yeah, I have an instant pot. I do not use it for broth. Um, no particular reason other than I'm usually making large, very large, multiple gallon pots of broth at a time. And so the instant pot doesn't feel as worth my time.
Understand
And
that.
she says, yeah, she says in the book, crock pots, pressure cookers, and stovetop, she gives them all equal place.
So
So,
yes is the answer to all of the
yeah.
questions. Brilliant.
And Britpop asked, is it really necessary to skim the scum off the top when making bone broth? Suspicious like us, we conclude that skimming is not necessary.
No, exactly. Not necessary.
Yep.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. Chance of Sunshine, that would be nice,
Mm,
says, how
yeah.
do you get the most flavour in your broth so there's no temptation to add bases? Do you just keep cooking to reduce the water content?
What is bases?
So, I, good question. Maybe things like flavours later on to add to enhance it, perhaps,
You get the most flavor,
unless
so
it's a
there's no
typo.
temptation to add bases. Do you just keep cooking to reduce the water content? Uh, but how does that relate to reducing the water content if it's
Well, I
just
would say if you
flavors
reduce
later?
the water content, then you're going to get more flavour. But I would just not put as much
So,
water in the first place.
does chance of sunshine
Mm.
mean? Tell us if we interpreted your question correctly. Um, there's no temptation to add bases when you're making something, like when you're making a soup, say, with
Ah, I see
broth.
what you mean.
How do you
Yeah,
get a really
I see what you
flavorful
mean.
broth so I don't also
Yeah, I
throw in
get it.
like bouillon cubes or something? Is that what they
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, that's what
Possibly.
she means. You're right. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right.
I would also say that if you are cooking the broth for a really, really, really long time, ask me how I know. Next question, we'll get into this. It does change the flavor, not always to the improvement of the flavor.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, the just cover the bones with water, pack in more bones,
Is that the day
add
that
your
you went on holiday and left your bone broth on?
every day, you mean? All the time. Okay, let's read Emily
Sorry,
D.
I
Bloom's
interrupted you.
question because this no, this
Oh, I
this
want to hang on.
this kind of loops.
I want
Oh,
to add
sorry.
something to the chance of sunshine question. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't want her to use a bouillon cube. I don't want her to. I want, or it
Uh-uh.
might be him. Sorry. So
I'm
I'd
not that
say
desperate yet.
use
Yeah.
less water if it's
Mhm.
still not strong enough afterwards, you can reduce it by just boiling it. You can add carrots, onions, and celery. You can add garlic. You can add peelings from vegetables that you've chopped, and put quite a lot of those in. You know, the carrots and the onions do make a difference. They give a real sweetness
Mhm,
and
mhm.
a robustness to it. Add herbs and spices as well. And even if it's just, you know, a handful of black peppercorns and some salt, if you've got spices around, add those as well. I mean, Better Broths and Healing Tonics has a myriad of different options.
Many,
And
many.
just the more possibilities of flavour you include in that pot at the beginning, the better the broth's going to be and the less water you put in. Okay,
Right.
right.
And
You can go to the next
if you
question
have
now.
a mhm, if you have a bland uh broth, I don't, you shouldn't if you're following these instructions as we've
Yeah.
given here. But also, if you want it to be more herbaceous, I think we might have talked about this on the essential oils episode, Allison, but I don't remember when that went out.
Mm.
But you can add a drop of basil or oregano or something to a
Yeah.
cooked broth, and it lights it up. It's delicious, and you'd not have any urge to use a base with that. So,
Yeah.
okay, so
Wonderful.
we good on that one?
Yes, yes,
All
I am
right.
now. Thank you.
Okay. Emily P. Bloom says, "Can I let my broth simmer for several days? Is there a reason not to do this? Are there nutritional differences or advantages to longer versus shorter cooking time?" What say you, Allison?
Well, I wasn't sure about this one because I just do my stock for the length of time I do my stock. The book, Better Broths and Healing Tonics, says the longer you leave it, the more nutrition and the more collagen you'll get. But they do cap their broth at 20 hours. And I've never done more than 27 hours. Don't think I've really noticed much of a difference because I just generally do it 24 hours every time. Have you?
Mm, yes. um, I don't know if
Ah,
it
okay.
improves the nutritional content or not, but but you know how we like to look in the old days and see what people did. I have heard and read
Mm,
many ancestral stories, and I've also heard from older people who remembered seeing this about pots that just simmered for sometimes years, and they would pull things from and add to them. So
wow.
I guess it was like a sourdough soup, basically. And in fact, I've been told
Mm,
that in some restaurants in some countries, they still have a huge vat of sour soup that they add and take from infinitely that has been going for years. So somewhere somebody is boiling things for a really long time. Um, I
wow.
have cooked broth. Yeah, right. Yeah, I remember my uncle telling me that traditionally in some places, um, he's Japanese, so in more of the Asian countries was what he was referring to. That there would just be a pot perpetually on the back of a stove somewhere, always, forever.
Yeah.
Um, I've cooked broth for several days at a time. Like, oh, I think I'm going to strain it today at
Ooh.
lunch. Doesn't happen. We'll just turn it back on and let it keep going until tomorrow because I don't have anywhere to put it to keep it cold. And sometimes it does improve the flavor, and sometimes it doesn't. It can kind of taste like overcooked herbs, depending on what you put in it or what I put in it, I should say. But it isn't like the broth that goes for 3 days is so brilliantly better that I'm going to go to the extent of trying to cook it any longer than 24 hours. I can't say there's a significant difference in flavor.
Okay, that's useful.
Yeah. Well,
Okay,
let's talk about
let's go on
using
to the
broth
next
then.
section. Yeah, which is using broth. So,
Mhm.
Dawn Suzette Smith, who is another one of our Patreons, says how to use broth beyond soup, stew, and making rice. And we also
Mm.
had another question, a similar one from Alicia X Chell, who says, what are fun ways to incorporate broths that are not hot meals? So here I'd kind of point you to Better Broths and Healing Tonics. As I said, it's a whole world of using broths in different ways. So, you know, they do have the soups and the stews in there, but they have some really unusual main dishes. And then they have infusions, they have tonics, they have like lattes. Literally, there's one that uses cacao nibs in it. There's, almond butter add-ins. There's different recipes for different needs. So, some of them have particular herbs in to help with this. Some of them have particular herbs in to help with that. And they really are fun. Some of them are bubbly and they're warm or they're cold. There's such a variety of things that would really fire your imagination in there. So I'd say, yeah, point everyone to that book because it's absolutely wonderful. For me, I drink my broth in the morning as my first drink, or I have been since Christmas. And like I said, I put miso into it, which just elevates it to another level. And sometimes I infuse herbs into it. I've blended in stuff guided by Better Broths and Healing Tonics, blending it with avocado or with cream. And I think what surprised me about the book was that there are sweet drinks with broth in. So your broth has spices in it that we would normally consider used in sweets, like cinnamon and cardamom and that kind of thing. And that's really a whole nother world that once you start playing with that, it opens up doors to so much creativity with broth that I think you could just keep going forever. How about you, Andrea? Have you got ideas for other ways of using broth? I'm sure you have. Tell us what they are.
Yeah, those are all good. And it's also traditional to just have a very repetitive diet. So don't feel bad if you're not getting this wild variety of things in. Erin Miller, who is in the Literary Life podcast group that I'm in, she posted a
Mm-hmm.
picture of a, I think of it as a church potluck coffee carafes on her kitchen counter, and she had filled it with hot broth and put a label on it that said broth.
Oh,
And she
nice.
said it was amazing how much more broth her family consumed with that in easy reach, and they kept returning for refills. So if you're just trying to get more broth into your people, that's a great idea. And she said she found her
Yeah.
carafe at a thrift store for very cheap. And
Okay.
broth that you cook without herbs, Allison, is a great
Herbs,
base
yes,
for,
herbs.
I mean, the H is there, so, but it's a
Why
great
not
base
use
for
it?
hot chocolate. Why not use it? We paid for it. Let's use it. So there's hot chocolate with broth is one of our favorites. And if you use one of those very neutral, bland broths, nobody particularly knows. Other than that, it just has
Yeah.
a really nice, smooth mouthfeel. There's also old recipes in every book up until the 1960s, basically, or 70s, for aspics and quivering molded gelatins made
Ah,
from gelatinous
yeah, of
broths.
course.
So you could really go to town with putting in sliced veggies, sliced boiled eggs. Um, Even I've seen grapes in them and things like that, whatever feels right. I've never tried to make a broth gelatin mold and dump it out. I would, excuse me, got the hiccups. I would do one in a bowl, but I am sort of scared to dump it out and have it fall apart.
Yeah, that would be really upsetting, wouldn't it?
I know, it would be. I meant to do
Mm,
that.
mm.
It's supposed to look like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's
So,
supposed to be a blob. Okay,
yeah.
next question. Elizabeth Feldenhoff says, is it best to use dried or fresh herbs in infusions? I
Hmm.
think dried is fine, and I checked in Better Broths, and they use dried herbs. Just obviously, with all dried herbs, make sure you haven't had it on the shelf for too long. We've all got that one pot of herbs that we haven't used very much, and it's way past its sell-by date. But I would use dried. If I have fresh, that's wonderful. But I think dried are
Yeah.
fine. What about you, Andrea?
Yeah. Same. Dried is cheaper if you're not growing herbs. So, use those. And remember, if you are using fresh, you usually need less than the recipe calls for.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Do you love oats? Want to try your hand at a traditional Scottish oat fermentation? Suan's is just that. It was made in Scotland for centuries and will give you both a creamy, easy to digest porridge and a tangy probiotic drink. My video course, Suan's the Scottish Oat Ferment, over at the Fermentation School, will guide you through everything you need to know to create these 2 ancestral foods in your own kitchen, no matter what equipment you have. Head to ancestralkitchen.com/Sewans, ancestralkitchen.com/Sewans, SOWANS, or click the link in the show notes to get a 10% discount automatically applied. Okay, next one, the Suburban Bee, who is a patron, hello Loney, says how to make cold bone broth drinks without it getting too gelatinous. This one, I've never made a cold bone broth drink, so I was a bit unsure about this. But I would say try to use bones to make the broth in the first place that aren't too gelatinous, so no pig trotters or chicken feet, and no beef bones that have got lots of cartilage in it. Maybe water it down a bit. And if you're kind of worried about the texture, maybe blend it, because, if you break up broth with other things in a blender to make a cold drink, then it won't be as gelatinous, straight afterwards.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts on this one, Andrea.
Well, I liked your blending idea. If she was alluding to making something and then drinking it cold, that's kind of what it sounds like. I guess we can light up the
she's doing
Discord with
maybe.
this after the episode goes
True.
out and get more specific with it. But I was also wondering if you put something in it with bromelain, the protease bromelain in it, like pineapple. Because I remember when I was a kid, sorry, Allison, I'm going to say a bad word, when I was making Jello, sorry, that it would never set if I put pineapple in it. And I ended up looking it up and found that it was the enzyme in pineapple keeping it from gelling. So I don't know if that same mechanism would work with real broth, but I wonder if she's making a cold drink and she mixed in some pineapple juice or something. I don't know.
I think you can buy bromelain as a supplement as well.
Wow,
Because
it
aids with. I only found that out this week in some random coincidence. It aids with protein digestion. Yeah, literally this week. It's just random. I saw you've written the word. You got the word bromelain there. So I think you might be able to buy it as a supplement. So maybe you could just put a spoonful in there. And apparently, I seem to remember it's good for protein digestion.
Well, I mean, broth is protein, so.
Well, exactly. Do you want to read the next one?
Yeah, M. Murdoch says, regarding the interview with Jill Shepherd Davenport, in the interview, Jill references making broth in 5 to 10 minutes by quickly throwing in several ingredients such as turmeric. What is her broth making setup at home that she's able to so quickly pull all those ingredients together to make a broth? And when adding herbs to the broth, is she using primarily fresh or are there dried varieties that work well?
Okay.
Tell us.
Well, I'm thinking that she's already made the broth and she's got it in her fridge, and then she's just heating it up and adding in her herbs and spices. As we said a bit earlier, most of the recipes in our book use dried herbs, so that would be fine. I mean, when I have my broth in the morning, it takes me just like a few minutes to heat it up, and if I want something else in it, then I'd slice some turmeric and I would leave it on a simmer for a little while to get the goodness out of that turmeric into my broth. But it doesn't take longer than 10 minutes. So I think she's already made her broth and she's just adding in stuff from her fridge and from her pantry and able then to create a broth very, very quickly. Would that be your take?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if that was when she said she had a really quick breakfast when we got on. I can't remember if we were recording or not when we were talking about that. But that might have been what it was. And I got the same impression as what you said. And I do the same thing as you. I usually use my essential oils because I feel like they get the flavor across the whole thing faster than the herbs. But herbs is, that works too. I would say fresh or dried, whichever one you had. Fresh would probably get the flavor across faster, but then you got to chop it. So now it's not fast anymore.
Yeah.
And I'll make a bottle, like a to-go bottle for drinking broth and just based on whatever my current whimsy is, put in the essential oils and then shake it and then just drink it in the car. And that's a great drink to send with somebody in the car too. I usually make that. Like if Gary's dad comes out, I like to send him broth. Because I mean, he doesn't want a sugary drink. So, you want to send somebody with something to keep him warm.
Rob and I went into Florence on Saturday and walked up and down the Arno, and it was very, very cold, very, very sunny. And I took a flask of broth and I sipped it all the way along. So, yeah, I'd say that that's definitely when it's cold, I don't want water. I wanted my broth.
Now I want you, Allison, to get one of those little metal flasks and stick it in your breast pocket with broth in it and just take a nip every now and then. Everybody's like, what? Drink?
That'd be funny.
Christy
Gosh.
Russell has a question. Christy Russell says, what are the top 5 veggies or herbs you'd recommend we include with our bone broth? It's a good question.
Top 5.
What do you?
Top 5's always
Your
hard.
top
Always,
5.
always carrots. Always carrots. Always onions. Definitely. Celery. I don't always have celery, but celery and garlic. I just put them all in without peeling anything. Herbs. Really, whatever I have, whatever I like, or whatever I think I need. And I think on different days we feel different things. Ginger and turmeric, I think, are very, very good to help you through the winter. So those can be added in. And adaptogens like mushrooms or ashwagandha, the powder can be put in. Or as Nicole, who's a patron of the podcast, sent me some ashwagandha she had grown. And you can put the whole twiggy root into the broth while it's cooking, actually. So
Convenient.
top 5, carrots, onion, celery, garlic. I've kind of done more than 5, haven't I? Ginger, turmeric.
How dare you?
Anyway.
You're fired.
Yeah, I know. Okay, all right, I'm off.
She's like, I'm going to go eat dinner. Yeah, I agree with you. It depends on what we have. And right now it's winter. We have onion, garlic, carrot, leeks, and parsnips. So those or the tops, peels, or butts of those will go in, sometimes the whole veg. And as far as herbs go, usually sage, because we have a bunch of little sage plants, and oregano and thyme. That's probably the ones that use the most. Salt and pepper, of course.
Yeah. Okay, another question from M. Murdoch, who is also a patron. I bought a bunch of beef bones, Emily, from a butcher to make broth, and after low simmering for several hours, it was more or less flavourless, and after refrigerating overnight, it was barely gelatinous. The question is, when choosing bones for beef broth, what are the best options? I don't necessarily think that Emily's bones were wrong. I just think probably to start with, she had too much water to bones. And also that she says several hours, a low simmering for several hours, and several hours is not enough for bone broth. A day is kind of more like it. And, with beef bones, they won't necessarily be gelatinous, as we've said. So if you're going for gelatin, you need to choose beef bones that have got cartilage in, or add in things like pig's trotters or chicken feet that are going to give you a kind of a jiggly broth, back to jiggly broth. What do you say to that, Andrea?
Well, she could make broth for the suburban bee.
Yeah, that's true. She doesn't want hers to gelatinous, does she? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, that's what she wanted. So problem solved. I would also ask, was the broth salted? Because broth doesn't really always have that much flavor until you add salt to pull the flavor out, unless there's a lot of meat on the bones. And that's my experience anyways. Broth can taste a little bit like dishwater, and then you add salt to it, and it's like you just shined a light on a hidden Van Gogh painting, and it was there all the time. You just couldn't see it. So salt.
I think also I talked a bit earlier about roasting. You can roast your bones as well beforehand, which makes them more flavoursome. Forgot about that one.
Personally, almost always, if I'm cooking beef, I do roast it. That's my preference.
I think I never used to, but after can't remember, the broth episode we did originally. We actually got 2 episodes on broth back in the annals of Ancestral
Hey,
Kitchen
we like
Podcast.
broth.
Yeah, we've got an early one on broth. And after we did that episode, I started roasting my bones and I haven't gone back. Just
Uh-huh.
can't go
It's
back.
just more flavor.
Yeah,
Unless you're doing
exactly.
gaps, in which case you can't do that.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on to storing because we are
Oh boy.
going for like the record podcast length. Okay, I'm going to read all these questions because there's a lot of them in one
Okay.
lump here with the same question, and then hand over to you because I think you've got better experience with this than I have. So we're on the storing section. Ashley Ryan 207 says, is there significant nutrient loss when pressure cooking and or pressure canning broth than if you cook it slowly and freeze it? Simply Anetta says pressure canning versus freezing. Wolf Mama of 2 says the stumbling block I have is proper storing large quantities of broth, trying to figure out if canning is better than freezing it. And Karen France 790 says my question is also about canning versus freezing large batches of broth. My in-laws think the canned broth tastes better, but I want to keep it as nutritious as possible. And Toka Rev T30 says, does pressure canning harm most of the healthful benefits of bone broth? Okay, can you have much more experience with canning than me, Andrew, so I'm guessing you've probably got things to say on this, whereas I don't really. So do you want to go?
I have feelings. Well, Ashley Ryan 207 hopefully did get their answer to their question up about the pressure cooking or broth, the instant pot question farther back. So hopefully that was answered. But as for the pressure canning aspect, Amanda and I, Amanda from Alaska, so she's on episode 52, which is called Homesteading the Final Frontier. If you want to hear about having a homestead off the grid in Alaska, she and I were having a long discussion about this very topic a few weeks ago. We ended up going on a deep dive to find out. She had, as one does when one has a farm and a husband who hunts, gallons and gallons and gallons of broth and not enough freezer room. So she wanted to be able to store it in the pressure canned jars. What she didn't want to do was destroy her broth, as everybody has alluded to. They're all a little bit suspicious of that high heat, 450 degrees. Is that harming my broth? And am I just going to kill my product and then have something I don't want to eat anyways? So, what we discovered was that some of the vitamins, not surprising, can be lost during the process of pressure canning. But the protein and gelatin and the collagen in the broth remains. Our conclusion was that if broth is part of your ancestral diet, which would include various vegetables, ferments, animal fats, maybe some dairy products and eggs, organs, pieces of meat, all foods rich in diverse vitamins, that some of the vitamins, the loss of some vitamins from the broth would be nominal and realistically have only a fractional impact to your diet, if any. The benefit of being able to store and use large quantities of broth conveniently, especially if you don't have freezer space and if you need the convenience of thawed broth, those benefits would far exceed the possible loss of some vitamins. It is, in my opinion, Allison, I'm going to guess you agree, far better to use a homemade pressure canned broth than to not use broth at all or to use powdered or store broth. You agree?
Indeed, I do agree. Yes, based on what you've
Yeah.
just said, yeah.
Yep. And when I was thinking about it, pondering all these questions, then I was thinking if you were trying to rehabilitate a patient, say, and the only thing they could do was sip broth and have no other foods, maybe in that case, you would wish to choose broth that was frozen or even freshly made only broth. However, if the alternative to feeding your patient was to use a store-based broth, because as a harried caregiver with no time to take a shower, you didn't even have time to keep making and thawing broth, I would give them home canned broth as a better option. So,
Yeah.
the thing, Allison, this kind of jumps all the way back to the reviews at the beginning, is that you have to remember that you're a real person.
Well, indeed,
And
sometimes I
what Amanda
forget.
and I talked about, yes, I've noticed. You're just one person, 2 hands. And Amanda and I talked about, sorry, I think it's, um, getting too excited, how she's running a farm. Her husband works, like 8 days a week, and she has twins and a young one
Yeah.
and animals, and she's, buried in snow half the year. And um, when it comes down to, oh no, I'm going to lose a half of a percent of the vitamin A in our diet by
Yeah.
canning this, or hey, I can just pull a jar off the shelf and feed the kids right now. Really, really good food. You have to think realistically. Um, as to the flavor preference, I would say that is up to each person. I like them both. Um, and to be honest, once I've added herbs and a poached egg, or make like I'm doing the beef and barley soup today, Allison,
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you which broth was canned and which one wasn't.
Okay.
Um, Melissa, who was also on our podcast a couple episodes back, she wrote an article about pressure canning broth, and she included links to her tutorials on making broth and canning broth. And Alice and I will put that link in the show notes for anybody who
Brilliant.
wants to do some canning. And then if you want a great book on canning broth, including recipes and meals you can can in a jar, check out episode 62, which is called Building Your Pantry with Canning. And that was where I talked to our patron and author, Angi Schneider. And Allison, her books are in her bookshop. I have both of them,
Yeah.
and I'm putting the link in show notes if anybody wants to look at them. So
That was
that
such a good
is,
episode. So many people who
oh, such a good one.
had
Yeah.
said, I was worried. I want to start canning. I'm worried, or I'm a beginner,
Hmm.
or I got so many tips from that episode. So I'd recommend going back and listening to that,
Hmm.
if you can, or if you
Yeah.
want to can. Wonderful. That was kind of everything I wanted in an answer. So thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Hopefully.
So, next
Helps.
question. Lisa in Magical Wonderland says, how long does a large jar of bone broth last in the fridge? And is it recommended to have just 1 tablespoon a day? Um,
Hmm.
I
I
think
wonder
if
where do
you,
you think that
I
tablespoon
don't
came
know,
from? Is that the
don't know.
sauerkraut thing? Because that's like
Maybe,
sauerkraut, right?
maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
I've never had a tablespoon of broth a day. Never.
I don't have the
Um,
self-control.
no, exactly. I think regarding storage in the fridge, I think if you keep the fat layer that will form on the broth on top of it, it will probably last longer than if you skimmed the fat off. That's my experience with keeping broth in the fridge. If I left the fat on, I would say it lasts at least 10 days in my fridge. Once that layer of fat is taken off, then the air's getting in and it lasts less time. Um, Talking about the fat, I remember we've had questions before about can you eat the fat? And the answer is yes. I mean, if my bones were organic bones, then I eat the fat. I'd be a bit more skeptical if they weren't organic, because, like the question that we had about organic versus conventional, that person said they know that to make the fat, they're definitely looking for organic um,
Mm,
fat from organic animals. So,
right.
yes, I use the fat on the top of my organic um, bone broth, and I use it either to spread on something or I use it to cook with. So yeah, back to this question. That was a diversion. I would say at least 10 days with that fat on the top, probably a bit less. And I would say, yeah, have more than 1 tablespoon a day if you can. Obviously, if you're on gaps and you're healing and bone broth maybe gives you some issues, then you can take it slowly. But I mean, just have as much broth as you want in a day, as much as you fancy, as much as you like. Do you agree, Andrea?
Mhm. Yeah. And Sally Fallon even says that
Mm-hmm.
broth under a fat cap can last for 6 months. So
Wow.
I've, yeah, you wouldn't know, Allison, because it doesn't last that long at your house.
No,
So
it's gone.
I've actually have kept broth for a few months, several, it might have even been 6 months, under a thick fat cap. And when I found it, this is the problem, Allison, with having three refrigerators. I thought, oh, look how old this date is. Of course, I will have to throw it away. And I opened it, and the
Mm,
fat looked pristine. So I pulled the fat back,
mm,
and the broth smelled amazing. And
mm.
so we ate it.
Wow, makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't have
So
three
I, but
refrigerators, so I never get to that point.
yeah. but then I've also had broth spoil in the fridge. So
Okay.
I don't as a rule, I do try to use it within, yeah, I would say under 2 weeks when it's under the fat cap.
I think you can, I mean, my experience is you can smell when it's not right. If you are
Oh
not
yeah,
sure,
broth will tell you.
just open the lid, put your nose in it. If it doesn't smell right, it's wrong. So
It
it
will
will, yeah,
announce to you whether
exactly.
or not it's okay.
Okay, I think we might be on the home stretch now. And we've got some
Okay, so
questions
let's,
about nutrition. Do you want to read the
yeah,
first one?
good one. Okay, Peregrine Chape, sure if I said that right, but I like the name, says bone broth quantity in relation to fertility journey.
Hmm.
It's a good question.
I think as much as possible. I don't
Hmm.
think, if you, as long as you're not forcing it down yourself, I don't think there can be too much bone broth. I mean, in the past, when I've been unwell, I've just drunk bone broth all day. Bone broth
Yeah.
can be just drunk as a food substitute. So, really, in relation to being as healthy as possible for a fertility journey or any, healing that someone's trying to do, bone broth with its collagen and its gelatin and all of the proteins in it, it's a wonderful thing for your digestion. And so I just say have as much as possible. Do you disagree
Yeah.
or agree, Andrea?
No, I do not disagree at all. And I think when it comes, especially to protein, it's really hard to overdo it on protein because your body is a pretty clear message that we're full when it comes to protein.
Yeah,
So,
true.
and traditional ancestral food says that men should drink fish head broth for fertility.
Hmm,
And
okay.
I only remember this so vividly because a funny story was our Kenyan neighbors were trying for years to conceive, and we read about this fish head broth. So I made him some, and they got pregnant.
Wow, that's cool.
So I don't really know if it was related to the broth, but we liked to think it was.
Nice.
Homelander Homestead says, which is more beneficial, chicken broth or beef broth?
Both. Yeah, just
Hmm.
I don't think one of those is particularly more beneficial than the other one. Just have both, have all the broths you can get, really.
Yeah, whichever one you can get. And then Allison, you had a question.
Yes, I
You
did.
asked, and read Allison K in
Cane? Oh,
Italy
yeah.
question. um, how much protein is in bone broth? Do different meats have different levels of protein? And what about meat stock versus bone broth? So I think you
That's one.
answered the meat stock one in the beginning, didn't you? Or
Well,
was
not the
that about
protein, not the
protein?
protein levels. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, I searched my own question for this one. I feel
Very good.
like part of the reason why I'm concentrating on bone broth so much at the moment, part of the reason is because I want to up my protein. And I do have an article on my blog, which we will link in the show notes, about breakfast options for high protein. And broth plays a large role in a lot of those recipes. So I kind of wanted to look up more specifics and see if it's different for different meats. So, I mean, if you look this up, you get completely different results. Some people say that a cup of bone broth has 5 grams in, and some people say that a cup of bone broth has
Hmm.
20 grams of protein in.
Hmm.
I think it does depend on the collagen in your bones because that's where the
Right.
protein mostly comes from. I also read that the longer you leave it, the more protein you will get. So that kind of ties with what we were saying, that
Huh.
better broths and healing tonics said the longer you leave it, the more nutrition you'll get, up to 20 hours, they said.
Do you think
Meat.
that's
Hmm. Go on.
is that because you're basically breaking
Yeah,
down
yeah, you're breaking down more of it.
the okay.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
All right.
Um, Meat stock has a less wide amino acid profile because you're not breaking down those bones as much, so you're not getting so much out. But as we said, it's easier to digest.
Mhm.
But I think it really, even though the reports vary wildly, I think it's important to take away that bone broth has a lot of protein in it, and it's an easily digestible way to up your protein without having to really work hard finding other sources of protein or pay more money for other sources of protein.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that feels like an important question for me to add. So that's why I asked it.
Hmm. Well, I like that one. That's a good one. Everybody's kind of realizing how grain-fed we've been since the industrial food
Yeah.
problems began, and that we do need more protein than we're accustomed to getting.
Yeah.
So
I think I'd like to do an episode on
broth is a good
protein
way.
later in the year, and probably
I
broth
would
in
I would
particular.
be interested in that. Yeah, I would love that.
Cool. Well, we've been going quite a long time. So
That
many
was all the
questions.
questions. Good ones. Good
Yeah.
questions
Thank you for
that
sending
everybody
them in.
had. Awesome questions. And if something wasn't clear, do let us know. If you're one of the patrons in Discord, let's chat it up in the broth thread.
Yeah, we have a thread specifically dedicated to broth
Because we
on
all love broth.
Discord.
Well, that's how much we love broth.
Exactly.
But we can talk more in there.
Hmm.
And if we didn't quite get the questions, then we can nail them down in there. So
Yeah.
cool. Awesome, Allison. Well, I'm going to make stew with broth
Yum
for
and
lunch.
barley. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wish I
Beef
could
and
taste.
barley stew. I will taste for you.
Thank you.
It's just what I do. And
Yeah.
I guess you're off to do dinner then.
Yes, I do. I have
So
to go upstairs, and the boys will be home in half an hour. I've got
yeah,
half an hour
better hurry.
to go and make some food for them. Yeah. Really,
I
really
believe in
great
you.
episode. Thank you. And I will
Yeah.
speak to you next time, Andrea.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation. Come find us on Instagram. Andrea's at Farm and Hearth, and Alison's at Ancestral_Kitchen. Until next time, we both wish you much fun, exploration, and satisfaction in and out of the kitchen.